One, we're doing a test run, experimenting a new way. Instead of using PowerPoint, I decided to use these story map approach. So we'll see how this goes for folks. So my topic is looking at Pallid sturgeon, titled "Research Reaching New Places," and I'll go into a little bit of a story on why I've kind of labeled it and titled it that way, but wanted to give a little bit of an update of what we've kind of experienced in the last couple of years, and wanted to follow up then on kind of more recent developments and research aspect of it. We do have a very thorough program in our Missouri River program that does a ton of Pallid sturgeon research up and down the river, and we haven't really had chances to showcase that in the last couple of years. So I kind of wanted to bring people up in this group up to speed on some of the work that we were doing. So to kind of give a little background information, I'm hoping you guys can all see the screen. We're good. Cooling. Okay. Pallid sturgeon, for those not familiar with that species, this is a picture of the Pallid sturgeon right here. This species was federally listed endangered in 1990. What's unique about this species is that they've been around for millions of years, essentially around during the dinosaur times, their ancestors. And so this is a long-lived species that's been through a lot of different changes in the landscape over those years. And something that's unique about them is they're long-lived species, and they can live up to 80 plus, even possibly up to 100 years. So they're slow growing. They grow to large sizes. Some folks have seen, the ones up in Montana are 5-6 feet long, just big fish that are long-lived fish. One of the background, some of the troubles that we have is people identifying the Pallid sturgeon, and some sense of that is because they're in close resemblance to the shovel-nosed sturgeon, which is the cousin of the Pallid sturgeon, and they look very similar in shape and size in a lot of the cases. Some ways that we were able to tell is based on this picture. You can see we always try to educate people and look at these barbels and see how they're kind of more of a crescent moon shaped for these four barbels versus straight across. This is the shovel-nosed sturgeon. This is a Pallid sturgeon. And this gives another indicator with these markings. This is ink that's inserted that distinguishes our hatchery reared fish versus kind of wild unmarked fish. Some of these projects began kind of tracking some of these species based on some of our propagation efforts. And some of our more local projects began in the early 2000s on the Missouri River, where we were kind of in the sense, okay, we know they're very limited. Their populations were declined. We haven't seen them in some of our commercial fishing. We need to figure out how to catch these guys. So we ran through a suite of different gears for quite a few years to get a sense of determining kind of testing gears on learning where to catch them, how to catch them, and when to catch them. Part of that built into kind of more of an established program where we were already propagating these fish, taking broodstock from Montana reaches, is kind of where they had large adult fish, and taking them to hatcheries, reproducing them in the hatcheries, and then later stocking them throughout lower stretches of the Missouri River and even lower in the middle Mississippi and Platte River. At some point, we decided when we were using genetics a little bit more to determine that maybe there's some genetic differences between the populations along the Missouri River, and we felt it was best to maybe try to attempt to collect local broodstock in Nebraska and use those wild fish that are collected there as propagating, and then stock them more locally in the Nebraska or the lower reaches of the Missouri River. And that began in 2007, 2008. So kind of a running tally since the propagation program began, distinguishing kind of the lower basin is from Gavin's Point Dam up here in Nebraska down to kind of the confluence with the Mississippi. Roughly over 191,000 fish have been stocked in this system since '94. What's unique about this is based on our sampling efforts, we continue to catch and recapture a lot of these year classes. And so we're able, through time, over long durations, be able to look at trend data and growth and locations of a lot of these species that we've stocked, and kind of just determine survival for these species. Even though survival kind of varies among year classes, also our stocking rates had changed from year to year. We ranged from tens of thousands stocked at different locations to just a few hundred. And we've come a little bit more modest in the past years, recognizing that we don't want to flood this area with too many pallid sturgeon. We want to try to capture the genetic variability for the population by using smaller year classes. And so here's just an image of that, of where they've been kind of stocked over the years. So that's a little bit of a background. There's certainly a lot more stuff, but I thought that was enough to kind of give an understanding of where we've been at this point. So 2019 and 2020, many of you are aware that have been around Nebraska, we experienced conditions that we really haven't experienced in the past, with high water in our rivers and streams. And it's unique in the case that it wasn't just an isolated case in a certain basin. They've actually was expanded over a lot of our rivers. And we see those impacts with these waters. This is a picture of the Niobrara that we went up to in June of 2019. And I know it's kind of hard to tell, but I got my cursor here. This is formerly Spencer Dam off into the distance. To think that that's where the Niobrara River channel used to go through, that's over 1.5 miles away. So the rivers changed based on the amount of water that was going through those systems. And that comes, in a sense, I give it an opportunity for us to learn a little bit more and kind of see how the system landscape responds to that, specifically in the fisheries world, how the fish respond to that. And what triggered a lot of this conversation was kind of began in the fall of 2019. We got a report of pallid sturgeon being captured by anglers, and took us by surprise a little bit in the sense of where their location was. And I'll show you in a minute where they captured it. But moving into the spring of this year, we had repeated cases of anglers catching pallid sturgeon species at different locations across the state. In this case, I kind of summarize, we've had 9 reported cases of species occurrence in just Nebraska's interior streams between this time period. And then more specifically, 7 of those observations came between May and June of this year. Based on kind of photo evidence and conversations with folks to give details of the descriptions of those species, we were able to determine that 7 of those actually were in fact pallid sturgeon. 1 was a shovel-nosed sturgeon, and 1 kind of remained undetermined. And so why that's significant is when I bring up this map, you look at the red line represents kind of where we've established as a pallid sturgeon's native, current range distribution along Nebraska. And this in cases part of the Platte River here, and then the lower stretch of the Elkhorn River. The dots represent the locations of where these anglers had been catching them and reported where their locations were observed, which comes to surprise. We recognize that these fish moved up into the system when these opportunities came available, and this is a perfect example of that. So I wanted to highlight a little bit into the Loup River. This was the one that was reported in October 2019. This was a location that was far up the Loup River, and it actually meets to kind of a barrier right here. This is unique because this is kind of where the diversion for the Loup Power Canal begins. And so this is a location actually happens to be a popular fishing spot for a lot of anglers who had to be catching catfish, but were surprised to pull in a pallid sturgeon of pretty good size. And so I wanted to highlight that is the fact that, we hadn't previously had any records of pallid sturgeon in the Loup River. And not only was it in the Loup River, it was 40, 50 miles upstream the Loup River. So it found opportunities when it was offered to it to move that far upstream. So why is this significant? Well, I mentioned it, hinted at it a few times, water, and how much water. So if we look at hydrographs, this kind of explains the timeline dates. I've kind of highlighted this area. This is the Elkhorn River. And then this y-axis kind of talks about how much discharge or how much water is going through that system. These yellow dots represent kind of the median daily average of those flows during this time period over 47 years. This is where it was in 2020. So 2019 was high. 2020 spring also remained high for that duration, allowed these fish to have plenty of opportunity to move further up in the stream. Similar case at the Platte River. This is near Grand Island, almost double the normal amount of water that was going into that system, which evidently provided opportunities for these fish to move on. And so the second part why this is significant is the fact that anglers were the ones that were actually capturing these fish and then reporting them to folks, some of our district staff, and then got filtered down. We kind of tried to summarize this information, and that's kind of where we were going at, to try to track this information. We know in the past that anglers have caught these. We just haven't really documented it in a sense and kept track of that. And so this is kind of unique, and these are pictures from anglers that were actually taking them. Also need to probably do an announcement or something of proper ways to handle pallid sturgeon. This one always makes me nervous. It's a heavy fish. It's hard to hold by the tail. So kind of moving on to that, it sparks interest, and we knew there was evidence that these fish moved into these systems. Our kind of efforts, our future efforts that we want to look at in the Rivers and Streams program is to kind of do additional sampling in these areas to get a better understanding of how often these fish use these areas, when they use these areas, and can we effectively capture these fish in these areas. And so we have hopes to continue doing some work in the Loup and the Platte Rivers. There's been previous work with the university doing a lot of stuff in the lower Platte Rivers a lot of years, getting good information, so we can use that as kind of a baseline for what we can build upon for sampling effort-wise. But as you can see, we had catches in the Elkhorn and the Niobrara rivers, and with kind of Spencer Dam out of commission and kind of rerouted, has actually opened the doors for pallid sturgeon to move further upstream. So I wanted to give some updates. Let me go back. Kind of in developments and research and what we've kind of learned in the last couple of years. In fact, I don't know if many people are aware, but there has been evidence of wild origin fish captured on the Missouri River to signify that there has been successful spawning. And in fact, 11 of these age 0, so fish that aren't quite a year old yet, have been captured on the Missouri River in 2 years where there was sampling that was done, in 2014 and 2018. And in 2018 or 2014, in fact, in more detail on that, they were actually embryo-sized fish, so very tiny fish. They're even smaller than these pictured here. They still essentially have the egg sac, and they're kind of at the mercy of the current. They don't have any control to be able to navigate in the stream, so it's based on whatever the drift is going on in the stream. What's unique about this is that these fish were captured along Nebraska borders, one above the Platte River confluence and one down at Nebraska City. In 2018, similar cases where they've caught pre-1-year-old, so age 0 fish downstream, actually at river miles 314 and 310, so just downstream of Kansas City. And those were actually a little bit older fish, so probably a little bit closer to this size here, where they're a couple weeks old. They're able to navigate a little bit in the water, and so they can kind of navigate to areas where they kind of be sustainable. And so that's kind of a very important note, that we've kind of recognized that, and we've done a lot of follow-ups in these areas, and the continued monitoring to catch these fish, because it gives us a lot of information on how they kind of go through their life cycle. The limiting factor is that we still haven't been able to document occurrences up to growing up to year 1 fish. That is a limiting area, and so we know that now that they can spawn, we don't know what happens to those little fish for the next year. Either they become food for other big catfish, or they get pushed a little bit further downstream. So part of that is we've expanded our sampling efforts for these little guys into the middle Mississippi River, with hopes that maybe we can be able to document some of those fish actually being filtered or pushed downstream into the middle Mississippi River, where maybe the theory is that they spend the early years of their life down in that area, favoriting certain habitats or something like that, and when they become adults, they move back upstream. And we can document that those adults moving back into this area, kind of a sense that I've created this heat map here that kind of shows some of the hot spots of where we've collected wild origin pallid sturgeon along Nebraska border in the lower, and we have certainly higher densities that congregate to these areas. Granted, we do a little bit more sampling in this area to intensify that area, but we consistently capture these fish in these locations along the Nebraska's border. And I wanted to hit that because it's interesting. We're still trying to determine why that is, and we look at the habitat aspects of it to kind of get an understanding of, okay, are they favoriting certain habitats here? Why are they choosing this area?
3 minutes.
Okay, thanks. And where can we go from that to maybe increase those opportunities by creating some of that habitat? But right now, as kind of Gerald hinted at that in his plenary talk yesterday, some of that habitat projects have currently been put on hold at the moment. And kind of the main priorities for the Corps of Engineers right now is to kind of do work to kind of manage the river back to pre-flood conditions in response to 2019. I also wanted to highlight some of this other new research that came out as this summer. There was some folks, scientists, and university with Mark Pegg, Marty Hamill, John Sturgeon, and Kirk Stephenson put together this paper that kind of looked at all of our recapture data. So we've had the standard sampling regime over these many years now. We're starting to look at trend data, and we're wanting to know kind of recapture data. Every time we recapture fish, gives us a broader scope of growth, survival, indicators of kind of how these fish are doing. And they looked at that at 2 different scales, at 2 different basins. Essentially, we're describing this as the lower basin, and this is the higher basin, the upper basin of the Missouri River. This is an area where they kind of have the relic fish, the older fish, where they're 60 to 80 years old. They calculated this average for these fish in this area reach about 56 years. As our lower basin, they only reach about 20 years. And it brings added questions in the fact that, some of these fish were stocked of the same genetic material from fish parents that came from up here. They were stocked at both locations, so we can look at direct comparisons of why one grows better at one area versus the other. And to kind of simply put it, we look at these locations, there are significant differences between these conditions of the upper and lower reaches. Down here in this stretch, we would call this kind of the channelized portion of the Missouri River. It's a little bit narrow. It doesn't have the islands, the variability in depths and velocities as they do up here in the upper reaches. And so some of that probably plays into the fact that we see differences in growth and in the kind of the survival or the life expectancy of these species. And here's the citation of some of that paper. It's a really neat paper. Some final points, kind of just to summarize. Want to emphasize that this research is continuing on. It's kind of a multi-state project. You have folks from Missouri, Nebraska, South Dakota, all the way up to Montana, continuing to do these monitoring efforts, these stocking efforts to supplement the populations at this point. for us to kind of determine and give us some better gauge on how this population is going. We do these through some of our techniques of trot lines seems to be our most successful gear to catch pallid sturgeon. This is an example of that. For those that have helped out on our broodstock efforts, this is a popular gear. We also continue to look at reproductive status. This is, no, he's not shy, camera shy or anything. He's actually looking through a screen of an ultrasound. So we're assessing fish to see if they're reproductive, not reproductive. And we plan to continue to document angler reports. It's important for us if we see anglers out there, they had opportunities this spring, the weather was nice, they were out there fishing for catfish and they surprisingly came across a lot of pallid sturgeon and sturgeon species. We want to try to do a better job at documenting that across the state of Nebraska to kind of give us a sense of maybe their patterns and timing of when and where they're going to be. And to kind of finalize the point that, you know, you could say this is a cute fish. It's sometimes hard to say for fish species, but at this size, these guys, they're tiny in a very violent Missouri River that rages with different flows and handles different, you know, systems at different conditions. They need a little bit of our help to kind of move these species along and help the recovery of this pallid sturgeon. So this is something that we plan to do and to continue to do. And we're making, as Gerald said, we're making baby steps toward it. Sometimes we have some setbacks, but kind of the overall goal is still moving towards recovery of the species. So we want to just end that with some of acknowledgments. Missouri River program that does a lot of this, the grunt work and data collection for this stuff. That paper with the University of Nebraska, Mark Pegg, Marty Hamill, and John Spurgeon. And then I can be a good contact reference for that. And also Kirk Stephenson, who's our Missouri River program manager with Nebraska Game and Parks, is an excellent person to contact with any questions, comments, things like that. So, and I'll open it up for any questions or comments.